Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Building Your Scientific Pause button, inoculating yourself against the headline hype with the Farm Ecologist, Susan Cousineau. Fantastic to have everybody on the call, or if you're watching afterwards, fantastic that you're spending the time to tune in with us today. There's a great reason to be here, and we're going to dive right in. But before we do, my name is Javan Bernakevitch. I own and operate All Points Design. That's allpointsdesign.ca, which is a life and land design company. On the land design side, I work with backyards to 3,000 acre farms, helping people to become more abundant, diverse, and if necessary, profitable, increasing all of those things and allowing their landscapes to get better year after year. And on the life design side, I help people to clarify their values and then to live their values by using their values as a filter for making decisions. I help folks get a sense of where their natural gifts are and where they want to play, be it in regenerative agriculture or otherwise, and helping them to build new careers. And I even help people work with challenging and sometimes metabolizing limiting beliefs, patterns, and behaviors. We're here today because about a year ago, I started to see quite a bit of polarization that was happening in my field of regenerative ecology, living and agriculture and permaculture, and a number of these very progressive, very heart-centered, very land-focused uh, fields and circles and groups. And as that polarization was happening, people were getting more interested in being polarized than taking on the challenge of our times. We're in a sixth mass extinction event that we know of. We've moved our geological epoch from the Holocene to the Anthropocene because humans are moving more Earth than all of the geological processes on the planet. And currently, we're in an incredible state of ecological disruption and disrepair. We're actively pulling out all the cords from our life support system as if we're on the space station going, let's pull that one and that one. And it's getting a little thin of air. And it's getting a little cold. And as I was watching individuals in these groups become calcified within their camps, they weren't taking on more action. And it seemed to me that ideology was one of the main issues, is that people were entrenched in their ideology and they wouldn't walk across the aisle to talk to people who thought differently than them. What occurred to me then was to start to offer simple courses that were practical know-how to build the skills of how do we want to live on the planet as if we wanted to stay. So regenerativeliving.online was created, a simple platform to start offering simple courses with extraordinary individuals. We started with Joe Tobias, who's an incredible living soils consultant with understanding and working with living soils. Next, and most recently, we just started offering family food with Natalie Pepin, an Indigenous off-grid farmer and homesteader, and also a great lover of spreadsheets, as I am, to the point to where in this course you can put in how many people are in your family, and all of a sudden you have this entire spreadsheet populate with how many pounds of lettuce and beets and potatoes you need and how much protein you need, and then how many seeds you need and how much garden space. And we build a garden plan and we help people through the entire process of starting to build their food sovereignty, because at this point, food is probably the best investment you can make. And then I'm always looking for excuses to work with my good friend and colleague, Susan Cousineau. And so I reached out and we started to talk about a main problem that we were seeing inside of all these problems, which is we're in the middle of an incredible revolution, communications and a cultural revolution on par with the Gutenberg press. And if you don't know what the Gutenberg press is or was, it was the moment where we went from books being single, amazing pieces of unique, bespoke art that contained incredible information, but took a team of people to make that were held by the elites, to being mass produced, where books could now be freely distributed throughout. And it was one of the major communications and knowledge distribution moments of humanity, on par with language, both written and spoken. Now we're in an incredible revolution, which is the self-publishing revolution, the revolution where there are the ability for anybody to produce content and to be consumed and to make it look like it's content that would come from a reputable news source. I don't quite know what a reputable news source is these days. And I think most of us have learned that most news sources and media outlets have an agenda owned by somebody that has an agenda. But now anybody can post anything. And as Susan and I were talking about this webinar and this incredible process that she's developed and is distilling to you today, distilling 20 years of academic inquiry which is just incredible. This is worth its weight in gold to start to think critically about what we're seeing. We realize that it's kind of like the tip of an iceberg. You see a post on social media and you just kind of see the waves lapping over top of it, and you just kind of see it. And we're going along with our boat, but underneath it, it may or may not have substance. But regardless, it will divert our course if we look at it. And this is the thing about ideas. Ideas are incredibly infectious. And our ideas become our thoughts become our words become our actions. So just as we source our food, we have to be very conscious about sourcing the ideas that we allow ourselves to ingest, to take in, and start to consider and think about. It's an incredible, important moment to take note of, that anybody can post anything. And social media is a psychological experiment where the results are still not in. We don't completely understand what we're seeing, but we do know through a number of studies and experiments that if we continually misinform a group of individuals over a few years, and we come back and give them the right or the correct or the reality or the facts, they will continue or persist with the information they've been misinformed with moving forward. It's not like getting new information will make people change their minds. And so it's up to all of us to increase the defense of what we're looking at, to build our own bullshit detectors, and to do it in a way that really helps us to navigate the waters of all this information that's coming. Most recently, I was reading that we produce more information in a day than we have in the last 150 years. Like every single day with the internet, we produce more and more information because more and more people are able to share, which has an upside. But the downside is, what are we looking at? What's the value of it? Is it actually important to me? And at that point, and this is what I love about Susan's process, is it really starts to ask the questions of, does this have validity? And maybe should I unfollow a couple of news sources? Maybe I should start unfollowing people in social media. Maybe there are some news sites I shouldn't go to anymore, because once you start applying this pause process, you're going to start to see, well, maybe the information that they're posting is actually a bit skewed. And underneath this iceberg of a post, you have potentially an article written by somebody who has an agenda. And under that, they may have sources that may or may not be articles or scientific studies. And under that, and under that, and under that, it may be based on nothing. It might just be somebody's opinion. And this is where we start to really realize that we need to inoculate ourselves. We need to start having a process to look at what we're seeing and start to digest it and dissect it so we can understand what we're looking at. And that's why I'm so excited that Susan agreed to work with us today and to do this webinar. We're hosting an incredible course called Science and Agriculture. It starts on April 14th, goes to June 2nd. It's 6 sessions with 2 breaks in between. It's all about what is science, what isn't science, where does it play with agriculture, conventional agriculture, regenerative agriculture, ecological agriculture, where and how can we find good science, how can we tell what's what, and then towards the end, we'll start working with citizen science. How can we start to create our own trials and start to get good information from what we're looking at? And this isn't to say that we discount experiential evidence. The farmer who's been working for 40 years, that's experiential evidence. A couple of years ago, I created a documentary called Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire. And for the indigenous populations that lived in North America and in other fire ecologies, the 20,000 years of their anthropomorphic, oh, wait a second. There's too many words coming out of my mouth at this moment. Their human-based fire is evidence. And it's evidence that we're actually reaping 120 to 200 years later, now that the individuals that came to North America, the colonizers that came and disrupted the First Nations here, realizing that they had a great system of burning that really kept a lot of things in tune and safe within the natural ecological cycles. So all of that is to say, it's important for all of us to really question what we're looking at. And I couldn't think of a better person than Susan, who has steeped herself in agriculture and academics and science for the last 20 years, has an incredible urban homestead, and is this wonderful synergy of both science and practicality. And so with that, I'm going to quickly, just in a moment, pass it over to Susan, but quick logistical piece. Susan will present for about 40 to 45 minutes. If you have any questions, click on the question and answer button and make sure to type in your question and answer. And we'll come back to your questions after her presentation. After her presentation, we're going to have a short description of the course that's coming up. And if there's anything else, feel free to chat at me because I will have my chat open. And with that, I introduce the farm ecologist, Susan Cousineau.
Mute. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to share this presentation. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a new experience for me. This might have been a little, this might be, anyway. So I'm just going to jump right in. So giving a little bit of my background. So as Javan said, I do have about 20 years of various academic training, but I just want to start with a little story. I grew up catching frogs and leeches and beaver ponds and doing weird sciencey stuff like photographing photographing dead cows to see how long it took for them to decompose. And so I've always kind of been a biologist, but I really came to understand what kind of scientist I wanted to be when I was in my mid-20s and I was an undergrad, and I had an opportunity, which was kind of unusual, to attend a master's defense. And the young man that was presenting, he had all these elaborate results and this like very complex model with all these different inputs and everything. And so we finished this presentation, and the first question from the floor, so what organism, and I can't remember, it was a big long-winded name. And actually, no, I do remember, it was a Brassica oleaceae actually, and like, what was your actual organism? And he gave the scientific name, and they were like, no, what was your organism? And he didn't know. And it turns out it was broccoli. Basically, he was doing experiments on broccoli plants. And we all kind of chuckled, and I thought that was funny. And then it happened a few years again when I was in my own master's program. And actually a close friend of mine had been doing her work, and she'd been doing a lot of complex modeling and a lot of like complex experiments and everything. And she went to present her work, and it's almost the same. It was almost verbatim. It was the same question came up. It was like, what was your organism? And she couldn't tell them. And it was like it's a Plasmodium malarial parasite. But she didn't know what that organism was. She knew the scientific name. She knew all about its biology and its genetics and how it behaved in these models. And but that really spoke to me. And I saw that disconnect over and over between the scientific research that people were doing and the researchers and what was going on in the real world. And I knew right throughout that time that was an area I really wanted to continue addressing in my own work. So to rewind, I was born and raised on a mixed livestock, not really commercial, not really homestead, central British Columbia, so about 300 acres, very remote area, mostly beef and hay for income. We gardened, we raised some sheep and rabbits and poultry. But it was a really interesting area. It was a mix of environmentalists, loggers, farmers, activists, tree planters, gardeners, some university educated work, and all the way to like working class that had no high school, and even some people that couldn't read or write at all. And there was a lot of overlap in these areas of like university professors that ended up in their logging industry or tree planting in the summers to make ends meet. For some of you, I can see in the chat, you're from Calgary, Strathmore, you might know the Robson Valley. So that's where I grew up. But I came away with a very strong understanding that farming isn't a living. So that was the mentality that was really baked in early on. So I went to university, got the full immersion experience. I was extremely fortunate to have great mentorship early on. I started doing research my first year in college. I was working at a field station, so I got a lot of field experience with a lot of different kinds of systems of like small rodents and insects and kind of like big ecological questions. So very quickly turned me on to ecology as a study in systems thinking. And then before long, I was swept up in genetics and evolution and understanding not only how things change in response to their environment, but how the underpinnings of that change happens over time. Of course, when you have one degree and you aren't sure what to do with it, then the next step is you go and get another one. So I went off to Europe for a couple of years. More immersion in the field. I had an opportunity to go to East Africa, which is, you can see up on the slide is the photo. I don't tend to take great bio photos. And this one, I think I'm untangling some acacia thorns out of my hair. But that was an opportunity to do things like collect zebra poop, and we were collecting insects and parasites. I've also done some computer modeling, infectious disease work, a lot of lab and bench work in genetics. So it gave me all of those experiences over the span of about 12 to 15 years, gave me a really good overview of like different perspectives, different methods and cultural ideas within academia. And so especially going across the pond, I felt like that really broadened my perspective. And then in the slide too, there's a picture of my husband and I. He's also a biologist, and together we have a little homestead in Southern California. So today I work through my company called the Farm Ecologist. So it's online business, as many of us have moved to during the pandemic. I focus on giving science updates on related to regenerative agriculture and permaculture. I do have some one-on-one consulting clients, and I really enjoy working with people one-on-one to create more resilient farms and homesteads and create resilient business plans. I'm doing more workshops, and I really love writing projects. So a few things that I am. I've got like I said, about 20 years in academic training and independent research through different institutions. My background is evolutionary biology and ecology, so I've got 2 master's degrees. And then in 2012, I got turned on to permaculture, as trying to pull together my ecological understanding and my farming background. And that quickly became regenerative agriculture. I still have a dream of working for the Savory Institute one day. But that's what I am, and that's what I bring to this conversation. A few things that I'm not. Although I am a scientist by training, and I do highly value peer-reviewed research, I'm not an evangelist. I don't believe it's the only way of knowing. Of course, I grew up in an area where experiential knowledge is what you hung your hat on. My dad has been farming for close to 40 years. It'll be 42 years next year. And I very much value the on-the-ground empirical understanding that people bring through lived experience. I'm not an expert. So as Niels Bohr would say, you're an expert when you've made all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. Like I've already spoken to, I've jumped around a lot. I've worked with insects and birds and soils and mammals, and I've worked in different ecosystems all over Western North America, South America, East Africa, parts of Europe. So I've tried to really create a very broad view, and perhaps one of the shortcomings of that is that I don't consider myself an expert in any one field. I also don't have a PhD yet. It's kind of a life goal, but life gets in the way sometimes. So I do have an academic training. I'm not a PhD, and I'm not an expert in any one particular field. I have taken a number of courses, and I'm very interested in ethnobiology and native science, indigenous knowing, traditional ecological knowledge. I very much value it. I am not well versed in it. I'm not well versed in other types of knowledge, and much of the learning I've done has been passed through the lens of academic science. And white academics, so like Nancy Turner, Robin Wall Kimmerer are some examples. So people that have translated native knowledge into kind of a more academic format is kind of the basis of a lot of my ethnobiological knowledge. And I also don't know everyone. So I love networking. I love meeting other people in this field and related fields and talking to people and having conversations, but I definitely don't know everyone. I'm constantly getting exposed to new knowledge and new ideas from different people. So, all right, moving on. So why are we here? When I think of science and agriculture, these are just some quick ideas that come up for me, whether it's livestock and vineyards, orchards, row crops, field science, or, if we're sitting at the bench doing like some really technical, genetics work or microbiological work, those are all science and agriculture for me. One of the statements that really drove it home at November 2019, I was at the Regenerate Conference in New Mexico, and Nicole Masters, who is an amazing soil ecologist and consultant, she stood up and she says, you guys have 2 years tops to figure out and get really clear on what regenerative agriculture is, because it's going to be taken over the same way organics has been done. It's going to be taken up by marketing. You're going to see it everywhere. And we need to be very clear on what it means and what it doesn't mean. So it's not enough to just be doing cover crops, or employing like one method or another. We need to really be clear on what, where the science is going and what's needed to make a truly regenerative agriculture, and not just a sort of rubber stamping and checklist of quote unquote regenerative practices. A good example is, General Mills is getting a lot of positive press for having, for their statement of, we will advance regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres of farmland by 2030. Okay, so everybody stand up and clap, great job for General Mills. That's 1/1000th of a percent. So 0.001% of a total US farmland, which is around 900 million acres. I believe we can do that much better and much faster. I think that's a pretty low-hanging goal. So let's not wait and see. Let's get better at understanding what the science is now. While regenerative agriculture is still in its infancy, and while it's still being taken up and becoming more popular, I believe that we start by informing ourselves and learning to read scientific literature accurately, rather than relying on secondhand news and others' interpretations. So I don't believe that you need a 4-year science degree or multiple graduate degrees. I think you can do it, based on the knowledge that you already have. A good example right now, of course, is the carbon negative burger, white oak pastures, if you're, might be familiar. Whether or not we can farm beef in a way that's actually has a net negative carbon impact, or are we going to Impossible Foods and going to eat lab-based meats and basically a burger out of a petri dish. But the point that I'm going to be hitting on today is these headlines are created with an emotional impact of, like, they're based on how you live, who you talk to, what your friends are, your context, how you grew up, what foods you like, what you don't like. There's very complicated, algorithms and, in browsers and our social media that bring this stuff up for you, when you go to search for something, or you're going to look for information. So I've been trying to disentangle some of those lines. I'm like, okay, what's really behind this, and how do we choose like what we're going to follow, what we're going to skip over? And these are actually, this is one example of a whole bunch of headlines and a whole bunch of information that is largely based on, in this case, it's one study that generated a lot of this press, and that was that white oak pastures of carbon neutral, potential for carbon neutral beef. In this presentation, I'm taking the opposite track of, we're going to look at one headline that's based on a whole slew of different studies, just so I can show kind of the two extremes of that. So in a contrast, this is actually the study that is underlying those headlines. Ecosystem impacts and productive capacity of a multi-species pastured livestock system. So, raise your hand, say "I" in the chat if this brings up emotion for you. If this makes you an emotional, is this an emotional plea? So this is the actual scientific study underlying it. If we compare those headlines, we're going to see that, no, there's no emotion behind this. They're not making a specific, push, for you to believe one thing or the other. And that's what I'm trying to impart to people, and I hope I can share today with you. Okay, so why is this important? Agriculture has been the most formative influence on the planet. We don't even know what the full impacts are of it yet. So this is a paper that came out a few years ago, looking at how agriculture has impacted or is related to different aspects of planetary change. So the red zones are areas where we are exceeding planetary boundaries. The yellow is where we're getting into that trouble zone, in increasing uncertainty, increasing risk. And the green zone is like, well, we're still okay, but we're getting close to that line there. And what I want to draw your attention to is up on the upper right, there's this novel entities, and that's areas that we don't even know about yet. And then there's also atmospheric aerosol loading, which we know is like dust particles. And it's interesting, there's a question mark here. We're not sure how agriculture impacts it. I think we could actually really start to understand that better if we think about, bare soils and dust creation and everything. So the overarching, idea of this is that agriculture has had these global impacts and also has a global huge potential to have a positive benefit. But the big argument is, how is that going to take place? Is that through plant-based meats? Is that through increased grazing of cattle, of sheep, of goats? And so we need to take an action-oriented but a cautionary approach that's grounded in an ethical basis. That's grounded in like a contextual understanding of where we are in the world. The people that are involved. And science is really driven by what we can do, and we've seen this historically, and not necessarily by why what we should do or why we should do it. For me personally, that's why I've been drawn over the years increasingly to permaculture and regenerative agriculture, because there's a baked in ethical foundation, not only with respect to economics, but more importantly to social and ecological care. So that's been a really important part of the foundation of my scientific knowledge, of bringing those pieces together, so that we're not only developing a scientifically better agriculture, but one that's grounded in a cultural past and ecological understanding, and in not only do no harm, but actually, regenerate and return to the people that are involved in that agriculture. On a day-to-day basis, how do we know what's going to work for us, what's bogus, what's right, but for a different context? For instance, there may well be cases on the planet where a plant-based diet is the ethical right choice, and from a climatic perspective, that checks all the boxes, and other parts of the planet where it is completely out of context. And we need to understand, what's our context, and is this right for us, or is it right for someone else but not for us? And then what are we going to share and what are we going to skip? There's all sorts of studies coming out now about how many links are shared, and it's like between 60 to 80%, depending on the social media platform and depending on the on the context and details. But there's a large percentage of material that's shared without ever being clicked on. So people will share articles and they haven't actually read it. They haven't opened it up to see what it's actually about. And I want to move us beyond that, advance that conversation. So I've already been sort of doing this work. And then when Javan came to me about a year ago, and we started talking about this, we're like, what would actually be, what would a process look like for people? So we came up with what we called our pause button. So pause is an acronym. We all love our acronyms. I also studied in France, where acronyms are, make the world go round. So there's a lot of hype and claims in regenerative agriculture and permaculture. And what I'd like to see more of people doing is just pause. So pause stands for pause, ask, understand, source, and explore. So that means that we're stopping at like a clickbait headline. So a clickbait is any kind of online content that tempts you to click and read. So it's got that emotional appeal, like I showed you earlier with the hamburger headlines. It's often misleading. There can be a news aspect. It's designed to attract readers to click on links to online stories, and it generates an income for the website owner, for advertising dollars. There's also fake news, which is becoming increasingly widespread and problematic. If you Google fake news, you can find all sorts of fake news generators. They can either be human or AI or artificial intelligence computer generated, but they're literally fake articles generated to populate news websites. You can actually see this in a lot of websites. If you go to the bottom, they're like little gallery images at the bottom, and often they'll include like the name of the town that you're in, or the name of the town that you commonly search from, if those are different. They'll have like certain details that are exactly geared to get your attention based on your browsing history. Sensational headlines in general and social media conversations. We see a lot of this. I know Javan and I have talked about this a lot, of social media conversations that have just gotten out of control. Somebody will post a headline, and then everybody just like, it's kind of a dog pile of like reacting to the headline, or like trying to pick apart different pieces of it. And it's like, how can we get to better conversations that move us forward? So this is the tool that we developed. It's a 5-step process, but you don't need to memorize all of the details. So this is basically just your template to just slow down and start digging into things. And I'll give you a few steps. We go into this in much more detail in the course, a lot of like the individual steps that you can use and different, and the details of that. It's generally you stop and consider the headline, investigate the context of the article and the underlying studies, and dig deeper into those studies to decide where to go next. So I'll hit on this later too, but the E is not for end, it's for explore. So take a deep breath. Pause is always good. If anyone else would like to join me in taking a deep breath. So many of my mentors that I'm working with now are really, especially during the pandemic, we're all starting with a calming breath at the beginning, and I can sometimes skip over that. So I always welcome a deep breath. It also helps to bring kind of the blood back into the front of your brain, which we'll start with. So the first thing is when you see one of these headlines is just pause on the post. So pause on that headline, stop before you click. And what I like to say is get your brain on board. We can ask questions like, what is this headline actually attempting to convey? Do I feel emotionally drawn into this? Am I being manipulated a little bit maybe? Is this something that I really care about? So when I say get your brain on board, I mean physically, literally, we have what we call a tripartite brain or triune brain. And our limbic system is where there's all this like emotional stuff, and that gets triggered. It can even get back into our like reptilian, brain stem part of our brain, where we start to react based on our emotions. When you slow that down, and this is deeply related to the vagus nerve, and if you're breathing deeply, it actually triggers your brain to move back into the blood to move back into your prefrontal cortex, which is where all of your logic works, all of your language and your thought processes. So what we want to do is just really get grounded in like, okay, I'm thinking, I'm not reacting. And just starting with that can be a really big step towards, towards improving our our analytical process. You can ask questions, is it emotionally driven? Is it extreme positive, negative, all or nothing? But also, is it something that's relevant to my life and that I really actually care about? So we're going to actually take one example through the rest of this webinar. So kombucha, kimchi, and yogurt, how fermented foods could be harmful to your health. So of course, like fermented foods are all the rage right now. I've totally signed up. I love my like homemade kimchis, and we make our own kombuchas and jun, and it's like fermented foods are all the thing. And so it's like all the press is about how beneficial they are to your health. And then suddenly here's this post of like, oh, they could be harmful. Oh no. So we can ask them these questions. Is it emotionally driven? Well, sure. Like this could be harmful to my health. We're all about trying to be healthier. It may not be completely all or nothing, but it's definitely like, it's got kind of an extreme bent to it. I probably do care. Yes. Cause I do enjoy my fermented foods. And so yes, it fits my context to understand a little bit more about this. I'm also going to ask myself, what am I hoping to find out or to disprove? So I'm going to hope that this is wrong, but I'm actually really wanting to know, like, is this legitimate? Okay, so we've got our brains on board. We're all in our logic stuff. Now we're going to move on to asking some deeper questions. So generating more questions around the material. We're going to think about who wrote this and why, and it might be an individual, it might be an organization, it might be an individual working for an organization. It's not always clear on blog posts, especially for institutions and organizations. A lot of times you'll see like this was written by, for instance, the Rodale Institute, the Fermentation Association, and it's not always really clear who the individual author was. But if you can find that individual author, you can look into like what's their scientific background or what's their background to be speaking to this topic. Do they have a lot of like individual experience with this area, for instance, with making fermented foods? And is it relevant to that content of the article? So, I mean, you might have a scientific background in like particle physics, but you're writing an article on fermented foods, like this isn't a great match. And then we're going to ask some questions about what kinds of sources they were using. In this area, we're going to start asking where we can access the studies that are behind it. I'm not going to cover this in great detail here. If you want to stick around for the Q&A, I can give you a bunch of different, like very specific search here. But basically paywalls are not the wall that we all think, that many people seem to think they are, they're quite easy to get around. So if you run into like looking for a scientific article and you come up to a paywall, don't worry, we can get you past it. And then what's the potential impact? Should I even care about this? Like, what is the holistic impact? What if it's, if it's true, if it's not, if it's only partly true? So those are just like the questions that I'm going to go through. So first off, who wrote this? I'm going to call this the kimchi article moving forward. I want to ask you, how did they get their information? Does it match with the headline? So as we read a little deeper into this article, okay, we're looking at, does it fit my context? First off, I just took a screenshot of the article so I wasn't scrolling through it on the screen. I see things like common reaction to fermented foods is a temporary increase in gas and bloating. First off, a temporary does not imply a serious health impact. Gas and bloating may be uncomfortable, but it doesn't seem like a really terrible, terrible thing. Some people is often a red flag that this is actually kind of an isolated scenario that they've inflated a little bit for a more sensational headline. And then something like too much kombucha can also lead to excess sugar. You got to be drinking a lot of kombucha to be getting that excess sugar. Like, just thinking about some of these things and the language that they use. So, I started to read this article and I'm like, kind of scratching my head, like, I'm going to need to do some deeper digging here. I might think about what context this would be relevant in and would it be mine? So, okay. So who wrote this article? So Dr. Manal Mohammed. She's got a really solid scientific background. I can see that. She's a lecturer of medical microbiology. So microbiology is, relevant to fermented foods in a lot of cases. Infectious diseases, diagnosis, prevention, and treatment. So she's, it sounds like there's probably bias towards like, ooh, scary disease. Having worked in infectious disease, people get there through a certain pipeline, and there can be a lot of adrenaline. There's sort of a like, oh, let's hope the pandemic doesn't happen, but if it happens, let it happen on my watch. There is a sort of mentality that goes into most people that I've met working in infectious disease. So that's a little red flag of like, oh, maybe they're a little more geared toward this like alarmist, like, this might kill you. Probably won't. But anyway, she's got a solid scientific background. Her focus is really, she's passionate about science and science communication. Great. Okay, we can find out a little bit more about her research output, other articles that she's written. So that gives us a little bit of background on the particular author for this area. Okay, so I'm going back to this. This was partly grayed out in the previous slide. But this is what the whole article looks like. Is like, it's a bunch of text and there's a whole bunch of underlined text, and each one of these is, I think probably all of you will know, is a link to a different source. So when I see something like this, it's a whole bunch of different links. I just randomly start opening up, like I might open every third one, or every 3 or 4, just to see what comes up. I'm not necessarily going to go through and open every single one at the first pass. So I'm seeing a lot of different links. And I'm seeing like, what kinds of sources did they use? How am I going to access them? Like I said before, the paywall is not going to be a problem. So I just mentally note it for now. I'm not digging into individual sources at this point, but keep those tabs open if you've opened them up. But just to get an overall image, because that sort of random sampling is going to give you, probably going to give you a pretty good idea of what the rest of the article is based on. Okay, so these are just 2 of the sources that I brought up, and they actually came up pretty quickly, which was in itself a red flag for me. I'm like, oh, like it was really easy for me to pop up like 2 basically blog articles. It's like, somebody's opinion summarizing somebody else's opinion. They're what we call secondary sources. So they're brief, very simplified summaries of others' research. So there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not reliable sources to hang your hat on. So I'm looking for things like author affiliations. So are they affiliated like with a university, with a research institute? I want to see a clear publication date. And you can see here on this bloating and probiotics, why probiotics cause gas and how to avoid. So on the right-hand side, last updated October 10th, 2020. I'm not going to scroll back, but if you, the kimchi article was written November 2019. So this information has already been updated since, that previous article was written. And then I'm also looking for what we call a digital object identifier, or DOI. And the DOI is essentially the social security number or the social insurance number, depending, if you're in Canada, it's a social insurance. Yes, same in SSN. It's a permanent identifier of that document. So when I was a kid, we had a sign hanging up in the barn: cows may come and cows may go, but the bull around here lives on forever. I think I was a pretty naive kid. It took me a very long time to understand what the sign actually meant. But when I started thinking about this DOI thing, this is actually what, kind of came to mind again. So I kind of tweaked it a little bit. Earls may come and earls may go, but the DOI lives on forever. So these kind of blog posts might change. They might disappear. This nutrition site might get taken down. But a scientific paper with a DOI is going to always be found at that code. It's basically a code of like numbers and letters and stuff. I'll show you in a second. Here's an example of author affiliations, Department of Internal Medicine. So these are two different sources that I pulled up. These are getting better. So I did sort of like a 1, 2, 3. Like those first sources are secondary. They're like, kind of weak. These are peer-reviewed publications. They're what I would call in like minor journals. So one is a Headache. The name of the journal is on the top left here. It's called Headache. The other one is in Molecules. They're not like high, kind of what we call high caliber journals. So there's a journal Affiliations. Those look pretty solid. There's journal information and a full citation with a DOI. Can you see my arrow, Javan? Just nod. Yes. Okay. So up here, there's a DOI, and I'll show it in the next slide. Actually, it's a lot clearer. There's a DOI here I circled. So that code is some combination of numbers and letters, usually a backslash or two included. That's a permanent locator for that article. So these articles are what I would call like really high quality peer-reviewed resources. They're in kind of more general journals. So Trends in Food Science and Ecology is it's a long-running, well-established journal. Similar foodborne pathogen. I believe this is Discoveries. There's always an acronym there. Journal of Clinical Microbiology. Those are quite general. They're long running. And the reason I look for journals that have sort of a general reach is because it makes them more competitive. If I didn't have an example at hand, but like if you're looking at a very, very specific journal title, like there's a Texas Heart Institute, for instance, publishes journals in that kind of a very specific title. They're often more looking for articles than having articles sort of like compete for publication. So when you have that competitive aspect, you raise the caliber of the articles, and it means it needs to go through a more rigorous peer review, which is something that I look for. So it's not a hyper niche. It's going to appeal to a wider audience, and it generally has more rigorous peer review process. You can also look for things like this article has been cited by, and it shows you other articles that have cited this individual article. So the number of times and the quality of the other sources that have cited this can be a good sort of secondary indicator of the quality of that research, because other people are relying on it for their information. Okay. I'm seeing 2 Q&A. Oh, we're going to hit Q&A at the end, sir. Okay, great. All right. Okay. So our next step in this process is to understand. So we've gotten sort of a quick overview of what sort of sources are underlying this article. We've got an idea of who wrote it. So Dr. Mohammed, who's got a PhD in medical microbiology. This is associated with the University of Westminster. She's been writing on science and science communication for quite a long time, and she's got a number of articles that are related to that. So we've got a pretty good foundation so far. So we're doing okay. So I want to understand more deeply the context of the material and how it came to be. So why did they write this? What are the authors trying to tell us? What does the underlying science actually say? And what other perspectives exist, and are they presented? So I'm going to start applying these both to the popular article and to the studies underlying it. Often in like a media article, there's sort of a call to action. So, in this one, it might be like, start being more critical about the fermented foods you eat, or you maybe stop eating them altogether if you're in like a high risk category. And so we're trying to like find out what are the authors trying to tell us, about this issue or about the studies underlying it. I'm also going to try to get an understanding of what the bias of the media platform is, because that's a huge, the media platform, for instance, in this article, it's The Conversation, is hosting this article. They're often paying someone to write this article. So they're trying to attract a certain audience. And that bias can, obviously can really influence what kind of information is coming through its doors. You might want to look at what come up as related articles. And then like we looked at quickly, what other articles has that particular author written? Okay. Okay, so we're back to the kimchi article on The Conversation. I'm not going to show them because it would be overwhelming and your brain would explode, but I did a count. I got the data. So we've got 31 sources embedded in this article overall. So there were six major bullet points that she went through. Each was about 250, 300 words. So it's about a 2,000 word article. There's 31 sources total. 2 of them I couldn't find at all. So that was a 404 error. The page you're looking for can't be found. 5 were popular blog style articles like the ones I showed you earlier. There are 4 case reports. So there was a single or in one study, there was 2 patients, isolated cases. One was published by Texas Heart Institute Journal, which is, like I said, very niche. And then there's one Science Daily popular science summary of a single article. So rather than citing the original scientific article, this author had just taken the Science Daily summary. And then there were 9 peer-reviewed articles that were like a subsection of a bigger publisher, but they were minor journals or very specific. So like the headache example, one was a book chapter. One was a scientific paper that completely focused on describing bloating in clinical terms. So if you're concerned about bloating, I've got the paper that will define it for you. And then 9 were peer-reviewed in higher impact generalized journals, like I talked about, that I would consider high quality sources. So in a nutshell, of 31 sources that were used in this article, I would really only hang my hat on 9 of those. The rest of them, I'm like, interesting, but I'd be wanting to dig deeper into those. So now I'm thinking about like, how did they get their information? Well, I just broke that down. Does it match with their headline? So, how fermented foods could be harmful to your health. They've got some, about a third of their sources are like, good science, solid. But does it match with that headline? Like, well, we're going to see. Looking for an alternative perspective, this woman had actually referenced this article, Do Clickbait Headlines Distort Fermentation Science? What I like about this article is it presents the alternative to the kimchi article that we're talking about here, but she starts with actually the positive clickbait. So like good gut health fixes everything, like basically fermented foods as a silver bullet. And she's saying like either extreme is going to be negative, which is great. So here's our alternative perspective. And I could, this is kind of a clickbaity article, but it's actually one that's well done. And she's really done a lot of work to present both sides of it in, contrast to this article that we're looking at, the kimchi article. Okay, so getting a little deeper into this, kimchi article. She actually took 2 sections of this article, so about 600 words of her approximately 2,000 word article, focusing on the potential like impacts or negative relationships with histamine intolerance. So histamine intolerance, if you have histamine intolerance and you eat fermented foods, the bacteria in fermented foods can produce a lot of histamines. It's the amino acids that are produced by the bacteria during food breakdown. You could have headaches, you could have bloating, you could have all these like terrible, fatigue and hives and digestive systems. Histamine intolerance occurs in about 1% of the population. So if you know you have histamine intolerance, you might want to be wary of certain fermented foods or have a better, really good, solid understanding of what you're eating. About 80% of those are middle-aged. So I know a few people on this call, but for the most part, we're probably all sort of in that bracket. So that might be okay. But really 1% of the population, this is not going to be a red flag that like, oh, I'm going to have to worry about histamine intolerance. And yet she took up nearly a third of her article focusing on this area. So that for me is kind of a red flag. Another one, infections from probiotics. She starts off by saying probiotics are generally safe for the vast majority of people. And treatment with and then she goes into saying treatments with probiotics can cause serious infections, pneumonia in vulnerable people, and systemic infections, including sepsis and endocarditis. There's also this case here with the liver abscess in a 65-year-old diabetic. If you read, as I did, if you go into these underlying studies, the 65-year-old diabetic already had liver issues. So it's interesting in that they traced the bacteria in her liver abscess, back to the specific probiotic that she was taking, but she did already have an underlying liver condition. She was also taking a commercial probiotic that was, I think it's 2 different strains of lactobacillus, which is, it's going to be, you're basically dumping a huge amount of bacteria from 1 or 2 strains into your body all at once. So, there's some caveats here, like, are you immunocompromised in the first place? So just, as we get deeper into this, you can see where some of these items are sort of problematic. Okay. So if we move on to source, then we're going to look at what are the sources of, of this article. And this is where we start to go into like who funded the article, why was it written? In this case, it might have been written basically to bring more people onto this website and to present, an alternative view to like the popular view, so they kind of wanted to do like a zig when everybody else is zagging. Where do you find that? You can find that on a blog website. You can find it, of course, like by looking at basically at the background of the media, at other stories. In a scientific article, you can look in the acknowledgement section at the very end. List funding sources if it's not given elsewhere. There's institutional affiliations. And in a scientific article, the authors have to declare either no conflicts of interest, or they have to be very clear about what those conflicts of interest are. And that's part of the reason that I really hang my hat on going to like what were the scientific articles that were used to base this on, is because they have to state what their conflicts of interest are, whereas a blogger like a media author doesn't necessarily have to do that. I also look at what the previous and related publications are, authors' previous work, and that applies to both the media article, for instance, the kimchi article, and the scientific authors. Okay, so our kimchi article. So we're looking at who funded the article, why was it written? The conversation is the website up here on your upper left. Academic rigor, journalistic flair. Well, we're kind of challenging that a little bit. I'm not sure I would camp this under the academic rigor tent, but okay. And host various media conversations on economy, education, environment, etc. So it's like, commissioned the article. Fermented foods is a hot topic. There might have been a recent outbreak or personal interest that spurred the author to write. I did go back into some of her previous publications. It looks like she's already been doing research on that area. So it might have been like, oh, I have all these resources already. I'm going to write like a popular article on it. She recently published some research on salmonella surveillance and foodborne illness outbreaks, which probably sort of, leaned this article that way. And like I said, some of those sources have since been updated. Okay, I always look for a bibliography in any kind of an article. A lot of media articles don't have them if it's something like this where there's 30 different resources. If it's written with more like 5 to 7, or even sometimes like a Science Daily overview will be based on a single article. But I try to take a look at those references just to see sort of what was the shape of the research underlying the media post. In a scientific article, and I go into this in much more detail in the course, but we tried squeezing it into today's talk, and it's just like, it's kind of a behemoth on its own. But I actually was trained to start with the bibliography. So I read through the references in the scientific paper, and I see like what was the context in which that study was done, or what was the background research going into that particular piece of work. It'll also often yield many more papers than you're ever going to want to read. So I will just warn you that, you know, if you find yourself downloading the entire references section, just to like take another pause and think about like which direction you're heading in. Okay. All right. These are some specific examples of this author's previous publications. Sometimes you'll have to hunt around a little bit to find it. The conversation has made it actually very accessible. So you just click on the author's name, and then you can go and she's got a disclosure of her any potential conflicts of interest in her funding, and then her association with the University of Westminster. Some of the article, you know, her recent research, some of these are peer reviewed, some of these are like say atlasofscience.org. So some of them are like popular online articles, but you can get an idea of what her background, her recent research is in. She's been doing a lot of genome sequencing in Salmonella, different foodborne illness work. It's a lot of genetic stuff. So, okay. In a scientific article, this is what you're going to be looking at. So when you get access to the scientific PDF, you're going to go all the way to the end and find the references section, which I said, like, you can, you know, I always find it really useful to read through that and get an idea. But there will be something like the author contributions and acknowledgements. Sometimes it's just a little sentence at the end of the paper. Both authors contributed equally. These guys have gone up in this left side here, have gone into quite some detail, breaking down what individual author contributions, individual sources of funding. And this is partly because look at this conflict of interest list. I mean, there's a lot of potential conflicts of interest, and that, you know, that means like each of these researchers, you know, either receive funding or they individually work for, it might be that they stand on the board of these different organizations, and they have to disclose those within that research paper. Okay, and then finally, we are at explore. So we're not at the end, we are at the beginning. Again, everything goes circular, it's all systems. So now we can step back and we consider like what's missing and what insights do I personally, or like do you personally as a human bring to this, you know, this understanding or this article. One of the things that's always rubbed me a little bit about the academy and like about, you know, the scientific world is this, like, you know, this idea of scientists being the gatekeepers of knowledge. And I see us as being the gatekeepers in terms of that we can unlock it, and we must unlock it for every person that comes by to try and access this. So we, you know, we ensure the quality of what's behind that gate, but it's not our place to keep it closed. And so I really welcome people that have, you know, life experience and their empirical knowledge to come to like scientific research, and, you know, and what do you know that either, you know, collides with this, or, you know, contrasts it, or, you know, what agrees and what is sort of rubber, like we don't understand. And then using that knowledge and the insights that we've gained through this process of, like, you know, reading the headline and understanding more about the author and the background sources, where are you going to go next? So do your conclusions match that of the article? What would you need to look for to understand it more thoroughly? And then what other studies connect to this study? So you might, you know, just spend some time thinking about, like, okay, what questions do I still have lingering, or what questions do I have now that I didn't have before? Like, what drew me to this article in the first place, and what am I trying to understand in relation to my own context, or what am I struggling with? Like, what's challenging my context? You know, what might be relevant in somebody else's context but isn't, you know, to do in mine. What other studies connect to this? And there's, you know, there's the sources that you can get off the sources that you opened up. There's the references from the underlying scientific articles. You can Google just use your, your Google Scholar, just your straight Google search to find other perspectives and get, another understanding. And you can basically just keep following this process around and around. And I just would leave this, this kind of tying up this process of like, science is not a conclusion, but it's a set of evolving ideas and concepts. So it's a constantly, we're constantly improving upon it and, finding new techniques and new methods and new ideas to bring forward. So I like to look at it as a tree. So if we look at, if we start even just with a headline, sometimes it seems like the headline is telling us everything, but it's really just like the leaves on the tree of knowledge. We can think of maybe the blog posts as like the branches that lead to that a particular headline. The bigger branches are like the popular science underlying, or the popular understanding leading to, what becomes popular as a blog post and then ultimately as a headline. But the trunk, or like the real strength of that tree, is in the peer-reviewed scientific research. Understanding that those individual studies are themselves based on an entire, like a root network. They're drawing information from all kinds of different sources. Small roots coalesce to bigger roots, and those eventually coalesce into the trunk of an individual study or a small group of studies. And then beyond those roots is the actual truth or the reality of what's going on. And that, that could be the soil. That's like the wider ecosystem that this, the study or this tree of knowledge is existing in and standing upon. Okay, so to wrap this up, why are we talking about science and regenerative agriculture? If you're just showing up right now, like, why are we talking about this? Because there's so much hype. There's a lot of claims. There's a lot of silver bullets. You should use biochar. You need to use cover crops. You need to build swales. Regenerative agriculture and the regenerative label is quickly being taken up around the world, and we have a very short window of time. Or I agree with people that say that there's a short window of time that may in fact already be closing before regenerative is simply another buzzword. So how do we as individuals keep the quality of the conversation high? How do we ground ourselves in relevant and applicable science and not get taken up either by silver bullets or by the naysayers that say it can't be done? So I mean, I grew up, I'm actually quite conservative. It's taken me quite a long time to really get excited about some of this stuff. Because I grew up in a very conventional, not conventional in terms of spray everything, but very conservative farming background. And so how do we come to this with a balanced understanding? Why a pause button? So I want people to start stopping instead of stop starting, to stop and think about before they click on that clickbait headline, before they follow the fake news. Check in and see if you're having an emotional reaction, if you're being drawn into this because of an emotional reason. Get those social media conversations back into control, get our logic brains thinking and really actually reading the things that we're sharing and reposting. Like I said, it's a 5-step process. You don't need to memorize all the details. I know we kind of blew through a lot, sort of a fire hose conversation. In general, stop to consider the headline, investigate the context of the article you're reading, and then the underlying studies. Even if you're just randomly clicking on a few of those links, get an idea of what the foundation or the branches underneath that headline leaf are. Dig deeper into those underlying studies and then decide where you're going to go next. If you're going to follow this, if you're going to let it go and decide, I just don't need to read that today. The big why behind this is I want to make sure people aren't getting manipulated. I'm seeing that more and more, and especially with the plant-based and the grazing conversations and the climate conversations, we need to increase the quality and the humanity of our conversations. We need to be getting better at communicating with each other and communicating, science between ourselves and amongst ourselves rather than just, talking at each other. In one way or another, I've been working on that for about almost 20 years, close to 20 years. And I really hope I've been able to share that with you today. So thanks for staying with us. I hope this has helped, and I hope it heightens the conversation. I'm going to pass it on to Javan now. I'm also going to step out for a little bio break. But I really thank you for your attention today. And Javan's going to talk a little bit about the course, and then we're going to go to Q&A, which I will be fully present for. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's such an incredible opportunity to hear from somebody who's been involved in this work for so long, has seen both within the science side and the regenerative agriculture side, and wants to raise the bar of conversation. I think for everybody who's listening, just the idea of pausing, just creating that pause button is a huge step. If other elements of this just flew past you and you're going to have to come back and watch the replay again, which we will be sending out to everybody who registered, just the idea of hitting the pause button and starting to train a response versus reaction of interesting. Oh, whenever something comes up, it's interesting or fascinating. What's that about? What's the depth of it? What's the understanding of it? What are we looking at? All of that makes really good sense in a world where we are constantly being bombarded with information and everyone is vying for our attention. And the one thing I'm going to point out before I go into the course and explain a bit about it is the advertising model has largely bankrupted the information that we get. Advertisers will push anything to everything to make sure that they get more clicks. And it destroys podcasts, it destroys YouTube, it destroys really everything, because it's the only model of support. So it's really important to start to become dynamic in our support, to support the creators and the individuals that we're really keen on supporting. If you're interested about this type of information, we have a course coming up in just a couple of weeks, actually, that we're really excited about. It's an opportunity to dive deeper into this idea of what is science, where does science play a role in our lives and in our conversation when it comes to agriculture, and to really come to that idea that science is an evolving set of ideas, not a conclusion. It's about testing and more testing. It's about understanding where it lives, why it lives, and then testing it again. There's this wonderful cartoon that was made years ago about, this is the circle of knowledge of humanity. And then somebody goes and gets a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree, and then they do a PhD. And then usually within their PhD, they do a few different types of studies and they'll publish. And it's great because it gives a sense of a PhD science paper is a pimple on this massive, incredible area of human knowledge. And it's one take, it's one viewpoint, and we need to take it in context. And to understand this, we may be asking questions of ourselves of, what is science and why does it matter? Can I inoculate myself against some of this clickbait? Can I use science for my own project? Is it possible to spot good and bad science? How does science apply to agriculture? How has it been used for agriculture? The pharmacology model has corrupted and funded a lot of bunk science, or has thrown out science that didn't support the claims they wanted to make. So how do we avoid that in agriculture? And how do I access some of those studies? So if you're in this webinar, or if you're interested in this course, chances are you want to learn more about science and the role it can play. You worry that you might have been duped. You value the importance of being well educated. And this is something that I think we're all needing to take on ourselves. There's nobody that's going to do that type of work for us. We need to do it for ourselves. And you have a desire to increase the quality of life, not only for those around you, but the soil or the land that you work with. So in this course, we're going to dive into all of these subjects. It's going to be a deep dive into this. And what I love most about this is that Susan will be there for 30 minutes for every single session, all 6 sessions for deep dive Q&A. Just like we have 8 questions right now, you're going to have the ability to ask all the questions you want of somebody who's been there and has already gone through this themselves and has invested the time, money, and energies. Degrees are not cheap. I love this idea that we all learn from mistakes. They just don't have to be our own. And you can leverage this course to take what Susan has learned over 20 years of her experience, what I've learned on my 15 years of experience, to put yourself further ahead. It's an incredible way of leveling up. When we take a look at what you can expect, there's going to be 6 modules going from April 14th to June 2nd. There'll be 9 hours of total education, plus 3 hours of Q&A. There's going to be a number of exercises to increase your capacity, and a community of like-minded people. I love these courses so much. In the family food course I'm with a bunch of people who just love learning about growing food. In the soil course I was hosting, it was a bunch of soil geeks. So this, we get to get even more niche and get the science geeks around agriculture. Our first session will be a welcome and introduction, get a sense to know each other, understand what our intent is for the courses, an introduction to each other and our experience, and really learning how to use the platform. Then we're going to go into what is science? What is the scientific method? What are other ways of knowing, and how are they useful alongside science? Again, going back to the Facing Fire documentary I put together, it was incredible to learn that in 1917, there was this gathering, the scientific gathering of individuals that came together that said, should we go back to the anthropological fire method of the First Nations here, or should we move forward with our Germanic forestry? And it was an emotional move, because they said, well, we can't give, in their words, we can't give responsibility, or we can't give authorship to a savage way of being. We'll lose ground on everything else. We have to keep on this way. And it directly led to the situation we have today with an overloading of our ecology. What are reductionism and holism? Really important elements to understand when it comes to our science. Then we'll take a look at science and agriculture. What's the financial, political, and social underpinnings of academic science? Where does the funding of that science come from? What industry science and corporate research, and why should I care about it? Where's the economic or the financial incentive? And that's great. What's the economic incentives, but the ecological consequences of such things? We're going to talk about accessing and publishing scientific studies, how that works. And Susan brought up a great point where you have high caliber journals that have more peer review, that it's more competitive, so the rigor is higher. So just because a study, or just because a post has an article that then has a minor journal article, doesn't mean that all scientific studies are created equally. We're going to take a look on session 5 about science and ecology, adaptive management, holism, and the study or studies of regenerative agriculture. Why are there so few peer-reviewed case studies? And really talking about how, because regenerative agriculture is ecologically based, it's systems-based, it's inherently difficult to study. It's trying to take one thing out of everything without understanding the whole of what we're looking at. Because so much of my work is working with clients and farms to tell stories, we'll talk a little bit about that as well, about how telling your story of the farm can really help people to understand what it is you're doing. And then in 6, we'll talk about designing experiments, experimental methodologies and design on the land, an overview of how to design experiments with realities of production and ecological results in mind. And the quote to put in here to really jog everybody's minds is George Box was a statistician, and he has this wonderful quote, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I love that image of the tree that Susan put up, because when you get down into the roots, you're getting down into the studies, but the reality of everything around you, the ecology, is outside of that. So these are models of understanding. These are ways of knowing. These are ways of increasing our knowledge. They are not the reality of your life. And I think that's where some people start to think, well, science is life. Science takes on everything. It doesn't. It's one way of knowing, but it's important to understand that way of knowing so we can move forward. As Susan talked about, the term regenerative is rapidly becoming mainstream. It's the new marketing term, and it's time to be able to tell the difference of what's actually regenerative. So we'll start on April 14th. We'll go to June 2nd. We'll have 2 weeks back to back, a week off, 2 weeks back to back, and a week off. And I love that Susan put this in here. I'm much more of a go, go, go. She's like, no, give them a week to relax, give them a week to digest. We're going to be giving them a lot of information. It's going to be dense. This is going to be a very dense course, but given in a very accessible way. So there'll be lots to move down and lots to move through. Something that's good to note, we've extended the early bird deadline until Sunday. So if you do want to save $50 on the total cost of the course, which is at its regular price, 350 Canadian dollars, you can do so by registering before Sunday. It would be a pleasure to have you in the course. And that we all learn by mistakes. They just don't have to be our own. So leveraging on Susan's work and her understanding, we can bring ourselves to a better place. Do you need any other previous experience with science? No. If you're traumatized by high school science, as I know I was, we can help you through that process and that conversation. I know Susan and I've had some great conversations about this. Is this a basic science course? Yes and no. The course introduces the concept of science to students. In the middle of the course, we'll dive deep into science and agriculture and how they work together and how we'll move to design experiments. So it's basic in that if you're a total newbie, you'll be guided nicely through it. If you're steeped in science, you have your own degrees as well, but you're interested in agriculture and science, you'll still get a lot out of this course. Can you message us with questions? Absolutely. Will you have lifetime access to the course? Absolutely. And it's time for us all to increase our level of understanding of science and how it can be applied to ecological work. And then finally, one of my all-time favorite authors, Isaac Asimov, the saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. And this course is about teaching the process of building wisdom and to take data, to put it into context, to create knowledge, and then with repetition, that knowledge then becomes wisdom. And that's what we are focusing on with regenerativliving.online, is to build more wisdom and practical skills in the people that come to work with us and take the courses that we work with. So if this sounds like a course you'd like to be in, we'd love to have you in the course. It's another 2 weeks. If you think this is a great course for somebody else and you want to let them know about it, please do send them the information about the course. Once I move over to questions and pass it on to Susan, I'll grab the link for everybody. But if you go to regenerativliving.online, it'll take you right to this course. I'll just copy this right now as we jump into it. So thanks so much, folks, again, for being on our webinar today. We're going to move over into Q&A, and just wanted to thank everybody again for being part today. It was so phenomenal. Oh, somebody already put the URL up there. Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, everybody. Helping everybody out. Love it. Susan, I think what I'll do... what's that?
Oh, I was just saying thanks, Matt. Sending it in the chat. Matt Barco was the one that posted it.
Susan, what I'll do is I'll read off the question and I'll give you first stab at them, and if I have anything to add, I'll go into it just to give you a break from speaking. So we start off with Emily. Hello. So what would you recommend if I want to form myself in regenerative agriculture? I auto-form myself in building ecosystems with edible forests since 2 years. I'm doing Dr. Ingram's soil food web course, and I'm documenting myself on AG and water management, reading books, searching on the internet. But I feel that I would need a proper course, theoretical, but or it practical on the field. It would be more secure about my future interventions and consulting with clients. So what I hear is they've done some of their own work, they've built their own capacity, but they're looking potentially for recommendations for further education. What would you recommend?
I would first recommend knowing what your context is, what kind of people you like working with, what areas have been, and Javan, your work has actually been really, really formative for me in the sense of figuring out like basically what your niche in regenerative agriculture and permaculture is, what areas really speak to you, and then what skills you already have and what you need to work on, what you want to work on, and what you're totally happy to let either someone else do or leave behind. With that understanding, you might decide to go ahead and pursue another degree. If you do that, don't pay for it. Let me know. I have some great references and people to send you to that focus on funding advanced degrees or funding education. I think especially in this area of regenerative work in general, I think there's going to be a lot more educational funding coming up if that academic track interests you, and that's a big if. So I think understanding what your context is and what your interests are is absolutely the first place to start, because it's a huge area, and there are so many different areas to go into, and I couldn't even start to list off. I mean, basically, I can pretty much pick out any academic field, even outside of the sciences, and tie it back into regenerative agriculture. So really find what you're interested in. If you're looking for specific training, and especially in at a farm scale, I have a hard time recommending anything other than the Regrarian's farm training, or farm planning, which Javan and I have both completed the first one they did was 2016. And Darren Dougherty's been world-renowned farm planner. He's been at it for over 30 years. He does a very solid, very systematic approach to farm planning. It doesn't really apply as well to smaller farm properties or smaller properties. And I would say under even like 20 acres, 10 acres. Yeah. In which case I would focus more on, like, say, a lot of the permaculture or permaculture homestead training. There's plenty of references, lots of trainings out there that either Javan or I could point you towards. I hope that helps.
Yeah, great answer there, Susan.
Okay.
Because I was self-trained and did my own exploration of this world since 2009. Again, I would focus on context. As Susan pointed out, my work has really been about understanding you as an individual, what's your identity, what's the values you hold, and then what are the pathways or the work that would bring you there. So if you really want to see people take charge of themselves and become more sovereign, I'm just using myself as an example. I like to work largely with folks that are working on farm scale. I do some backyard work and front yard work and things of that nature, but truthfully, it's more interesting to me to work at broad scale, especially when it comes to water. And so I sought out individuals who'd worked in water and had done so very successfully, which is why I ended up studying with Sepp Holzer in Austria with Darren Dougherty more times than I care to admit, because his training is fantastic. And I'm part of the Regrarians Workplace, which is a great way to test out the Regrarians. You can join the Regrarians Workplace for free. If you just go to regrarians.org, you can start to take a look at that workplace. It is, for me, the highest level of conversation I can find about regenerative agriculture with active practitioners and researchers and just exceptional individuals. I've had a great time being on that platform and really enjoyed the conversation there. And then if you want to work at smaller scales, I really appreciate Eric Olson's Ecological Landscape Mastery program. It's a great program if you're looking at doing small scale design installations or creating an edible landscape design business at that sort of scale. A lot of how people grow their businesses is working at that scale first to start to get traction and to start to get experience, and then to be eligible to then work at farm scale. For most people out of a course, you're not eligible to do much. You're eligible to go and get some experience and then start to build that experience. And once you get competent, you start to build confidence. A lot of people think that they aim for confidence, but confidence is a byproduct of competence. And so you need to spend a lot of time. I do a lot of teaching with Oregon State University. It is, for me, the top of the heap when it comes to the permaculture design course. We have an international staff, and we have an individual staff member who went through and found all of the peer-reviewed science that backs up all of the elements within that permaculture conversation. It is for individuals who really want to become designers. So there's 21 assignments to build your design conversation, and is the most rigorous PDC I have ever experienced. And I've looked at and been in everybody's online PDC and really appreciate the Oregon State University PDC, and continue to work with it because it puts through such incredible students who are doing incredible work and is just a high level. So I really appreciate that. And I'll grab a link for it and throw it down, because I have an ability to give people discounts with it. So I'll put that on when I get a sec.
So we've got 6 minutes and I think 8 or 9 questions left. So I'm definitely going to hit all of these in, I'm going to stay as long as I can. I think I can stay until we're done. But whatever we don't get to, I'm going to write out answers to questions and I'll send out the link after this.
Sure.
And Ron actually threw a question into the chat, which just pertains to the first question about the value of a formal university education, with all the free courses. I didn't do a lot of great parties when I was in university. I studied. It was like all I did. And I think there is a great amount of value in being in that environment if you value it and if it interests you. If you doesn't and you don't want to be there, then don't be there, go somewhere else. And that's completely valid also. Darren Dougherty is a great example. I think he has a grade 8 education where he never graduated high. So there's definitely, and this speaks to the multiple ways of knowing. So, okay, Josh's question.
Josh, Are there some links to these great critical thinking skills we can share when we see these types of articles to help others who don't read past the headlines, keeping in mind that those who need it don't read past the headlines?
There's plenty of material on critical thinking skills, but I have experienced for myself, and what I find, if you tell someone they need to think critically, they aren't going to. It's not, it's sort of like, and, there's some analogy buried in there, but I think that I found for myself the most effective way has been a combination of like nonviolent communication, active listening, and just doing the critical thinking myself. And going into that headline and or that article, that social media conversation, asking the questions myself, either, in that conversation or, kind of behind the scenes, and bringing those questions into the conversation. And I think that's the only way we elevate a conversation, is by being the ones that elevate it ourselves and not looking for other people to do it themselves. That would be my short answer for that question.
Great answer. And I think the other thing is questionings, Socratic questioning. So when you see something like that, you can, instead of posting, is this true or is this not? It's like, oh, that's an interesting headline. Is there any information to back that up? And to actually challenge individuals to start to look further. So great question. There's also this great webinar. I don't know if you've heard about it, Understanding and Building Your Scientific Pause Button. Feel free to send them the link to this. I think that's a great option. Jules, this type of discernment building should be taught in schools. Agreed. My 6th grade teacher had us study advertisements with a critical eye. It was very useful indeed. Please comment about school curriculum in 4 minutes. Susan and I have actually had this conversation with bottles of scotch. So
I was exceptionally fortunate in my graduating, the entire population of my school when I graduated from grade 7, it was K to 7, was 28 students. Within that, we had university professors that were taking a break from academia, from from other bigger teaching jobs. They just wanted to hang out in this farming community and teach little kids. So we had really high caliber education very early on, and I was super fortunate. So I can't really speak to the general crap that is public education out there, and I know that is out there. But Matt Powers got dropped into the chat. He's done an incredible job building K to 12 permaculture education. I think all we can do is, look for the people that are advancing a critical, more critical perspectives, using things like, I didn't have an exercise like really digging into advertising until I was in a college level statistics course. So I knew to be skeptical, and I knew all of these things, but I didn't really get into the numbers and what those numbers meant until I was in college. So yeah, that's going to be a tough one in a few minutes to cover in a few minutes. But yeah, this is partly why we see homeschooling becoming more, I think, on the rise, is just a critical perspective on the school systems and school curricula. So I think it's hard to tell what the context, Jules, this is coming from. And this is for your own kids, or grandkids or friends' kids, if you have your own children. I'm not sure. But bringing a critical eye to public school curriculum is absolutely essential. And working within the schools, there's going to be all different ways and in all different contexts in which to tackle that. So I don't know if I spoke to that as well as I could, but that's the time that I got, I think.
No, it's great. And I think it's really important for people to realize that public education, as we understand it today, developed in the mid 1800s to create good Puritans and to create good factory workers, to create people that could then go back into the Industrial Revolution. It was a cog making process, literally, to put people into specific jobs. It wasn't what so much of the Enlightenment was, in terms of exploring ideas or exploring an individual's creativity or their own opportunities of how they uniquely come into this world. It's really about creating a standardized conversation. And so inherently there's going to be a standardized piece about curriculum that's never going to have that that level of articulation or bespoke nature as when you do with homeschooling, or as when you do with allowing an individual to create their own conversation. So I love talking about public school, and would love to talk more about it, but I think that's probably all the time we have today. Thanks for doing this very important work. Are there any realms of research that are particularly more in need of reproduced studies to be robust?
That speaks to a really interesting graphic for the course, and I know I think Ashley, I think, is in the course actually already. So I'm excited to dig into this one more. One area actually I can think of is, I don't know what to call it. It's on kind of a revegetation science, and really getting critical about some of the existing climate work and climate modeling and the assumptions on which current climate research has been built. We are starting to see some studies coming out on the ways that vegetation impacts climate dynamics, but for a long time, as well, many of us know carbon and carbon dioxide has dominated the conversation almost to exclusion of all else. And water vapor, modeling water vapor and cloud dynamics are like mind-numbingly complex to model. And so they have largely been left out of some of those modeling conversations because they can really only be reduced to like very basic sort of like tinker toy facets in order to be incorporated into like more complex models. So, I mean, I could speak to this from my own modeling background. I mean, it takes very little to overload a computing system. You just get a few parameters in, and then suddenly it's like you have to start turning some of those into numbers that don't change, just so that you can keep enough of the wheels spinning to get like an answer out based on your particular question. So that's one of the areas I'm looking for more research to be done in, and I'm having conversations with a number of people on this front, looking for how we can actually use like satellite data, and of course, because so many more satellites are being thrown up into the atmosphere right now, how we can actually use some of that imaging data to associate climate dynamics with vegetation patterns on the ground. I mean, we've got weird things like photos of the rabbit-proof fence in Australia, and there is a line of clouds down that fence where hot air, hits the hot air coming up from the ground hits cool air coming off of the ocean, and it just completely changes the cloud dynamics at that place, and it's entirely based on the vegetation in the ground. I mean, you can say that the fence is like stopping the clouds, but like the fence is like 6 feet high. So I think that's one area that just immediately jumps to mind in need of more studies. But you could probably say that about just about any area. Soil biology, is really in its infancy. It's a very complex, self-organizing system of systems. It surprises me, there's still a lot of siloization between like soil chemistry and soil biology and soil physics, and then like the genetics of it, which brings to mind epigenetics. There's multiple areas that need more reproduced studies. I'm sure every once in a while you would stumble upon something like, okay, the research is like very well known in this, but I think there's pretty much any area you could point to, we could find an area where we need more I would say more robust integration is actually what it boils down to. We need a more holistic understanding, between those different, departments. Interdisciplinary studies are just hard. They're just very, very difficult and intractable. So yes, and multiple realms.
Great answer. Thanks, Susan. It just reminds me that when you're taking a look at irrigation calculators, even biology is always left out. It's always pure sand, pure silt, pure clay. Like once biology comes into play, there's always an issue, and it's the same thing with fire modeling. So it's a great conversation there. Ron, can you search DOI number to find free access to papers? I find I can search the title and find a source outside of a paywall.
Yes, I'm going to drop it into the chat.
Awesome.
Okay, so if you have not heard of Scihub, Scihub is your friend. Actually, maybe it would be better to do I don't know. I don't want to do a screen share and hog the bandwidth. So Scihub right now lives, I'm using it at the URL, which does not live on forever, is at scihub.se. And then you can make a backslash. I'm going to grab a random DOI off of Google Scholar. Oh, Google Scholar. Javan convinced me to switch my browsers this morning, and now I can't find anything. Campbell et al. 27. I know that paper. All right, so net community production first year CICE, grab that DOI, and you can grab actually the whole URL. I'm going to give you 2 ways to do it. So if you're looking in the chat, I'm going to show you 2 ways, and you can just copy and paste what I drop, or you can do without the HTTPS. You can just use the number. No.
And so basically, Susan, as you're putting this in, where does the number?
What does
Okay,
this
so
do?
the number starts after the first backslash, right?
Yes, yes. It's after the first backslash. And if you drop that into your browser search bar, whew, it worked. It doesn't always work. This is an accepted article, so it's what we call a preprint. So it's been accepted by the journal for publication. It's gone through peer review, but it has not been completely published. So it hasn't actually been published in the journal. This paper has been, it was 2017, it's gone through. So what Scihub is basically founded by this woman, Alexandra Elbakian. And you can search on, you can look on her name. And she was a Czech, she was a Czech, I believe she was actually a master's student when she started this. And one of the issues with academic literature is it can be very difficult to find in other countries, in other languages. It's just, it's a whole other world, trying to find research. So different universities will subscribe to journals. And of course, if it's a small university in a country like Czechoslovakia or, wherever, even, well, the Netherlands was quite well funded, but I'm trying to think, like say Spain or Italy, their universities don't tend to have a great deal of funding for accessing journals. So they will subscribe to like a few major like journal houses, which will be Elsevier or Springer. But you can have a very hard time finding research that you want. So this woman was actually, it was directly impeding her research. And so she started to collect university login credentials from all different researchers all around the world. And she got, she made a lot of headway because researchers will do the work, they'll do the research, they'll write up the paper, they get paid for it through their university jobs, and then they submit it to a journal, and then the journal publishes that, and the journal makes the money off of those subscriptions. The author of a paper never sees, like, they don't see royalties. There's no funding model that directs funds back to researchers, which is good in a way, because it means that, like, they're not financially incentivized aside from like their funding, and their use, their job, to conduct certain research. So Alexandra basically built Scihub, and there's so many people around the world that agreed with this, that when she started getting lawsuits from the big publishing companies, other people started generating, they would generate alternative URLs. So some examples have been like Scihub. I'm using .se right now. I've used TW, I've used LA. If you search where is Scihub now, you will find like usually the top 5 like most current addresses for Scihub. I almost don't even use like my university access anymore. It's just so easy. I drop the DOI into that URL and it's like, boom, the PDF is right there and I download it. I put that into a citation manager. It pulls the metadata, the citation out of it, and I've got my citation, I've got my PDF. I'm like good to go. So it's not entirely legal, but I entirely agree with the sentiment and the context in which it was created. And globally, there's a large community that supports this. So I feel quite happy to recommend it. There are other methods through Twitter. There's ICANN has PDF, which I can't remember what the generation after millennials is, but I think that generation understands why it's ICANN has. There's like ICANN has cheeseburger. It was like an internet meme something. I just dropped that in the chat. I've never used it and I've never had to use it because Scihub has always been not completely reliable for me. There have been papers that I haven't been able to find. The papers that I haven't been able to find, I've either contacted the author directly, or I've found an alternate source of that information or a study that was close enough. It's never been a problem. So that's what I do to get around paywalls.
Awesome. Thanks,
Okay.
Susan.
You're welcome.
Matt, are journal controllers required to list conflicts of interest? If so, who checks accuracy on the list?
Yes, they are. If you mean journal controllers, like the publishing, the people that accept or reject a paper, yes. So the authors are required to disclose those conflicts of interest. Who checks the accuracy of the list? It goes through, a few checks, usually 3 or 4 checks in the peer review process. So you've got a number of peer reviewers that are randomly selected from the academic community. Usually two reviewers are closely related to that area of research, and then 2 are often like from some, tangential, but like they would have the knowledge, but they aren't necessarily working in that field. So of course they're going to be looking at that and being like, oh, I actually know that this guy or this person is, working in this other capacity, so there's a number of people that it has to go through the peer review process. And then of course, once it's published, that goes out to the world. And if it's going to come up pretty quickly, if you're publishing and saying you have no conflict of interest and someone actually knows that you do in fact work for this other company, in which case it's a serious breach of academic honesty, which is kind of the gold standard. I mean, this is, how the scientific community exists with, such a high caliber of trust, is that honesty principle of like, if you got busted doing that there was a serious conflict of interest, that paper would typically be retracted or be required to be retracted, and your name would be mud and good luck getting a job. So there isn't really a checking body besides that peer review process, but the peer review process is quite rigorous, is rigorous enough usually to ensure that that's safe. Now, Ron posted a few, case of the toxicology studies and pesticide research that some were actually faked. There's been a case of what they call a paper mill. So a whole series of papers that were getting faked. The fact that we know about those is heartening, because other researchers are like, this is what our reputation is built on. And, these random researchers have basically made it impossible for people to trust everyone. And so there will actually be people that will sort of jump on like, okay, like elevating that to like, look, this, these were faked, or these, related papers were faked. That paper will either be retracted, or it'll just be so widely published as like, this is junk that, that it'll be taken down. And so I hesitate to say that I have 100% trust in the peer review process, because I don't, and I know that it fails. And there's all kinds of internal biases. There's, gender biases, and there's like ethical issues. There are inherent biases in that process, but that does help to ensure that accuracy. You can also always, just check yourself, like Google those names and find out, their affiliations, their previous research, who they've worked with in the past, and that'll generally like cast a searchlight. So I mean, really, you can put the onus on yourself, knowing that it's already passed a number of gatekeepers.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. Susan, I'm noticing that we still have maybe 4 more questions. Yeah. Do you have time for that, or do we need to shut her down?
So far, I do. I have not heard from my child yet. My children.
Thanks for giving us a bit more of your time.
Yeah, well, I appreciate anyone, if you can still stick around.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ron has a nice comment. Once you understand the science, you can take a deeper dive. Models that are misapplied and using false assumptions. Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, that's true. And misapplied and using false assumptions and missing assumptions. So assumptions that are not explicitly stated. And sometimes that can just be like, I actually ran into this issue, and during my master's, it was the first time that I built like my own like infectious disease model, and it was fairly complex. And so it was just such a work to wrap my own head around all of this. And the advisor that I was working on is very well known, very well established. He's been publishing for years. He's extremely ethical, and I had absolutely no qualms about like working with him or publishing with him. So we built this model, and it was got all these things like pieces together and stuff, and we sent it off for publication. And the reviews that came back were like, yeah, this is basically so and so's model, like with different names. And we're like, what? No, we read that paper, and like we went back into it. And it took us a couple of times to be like, oh, if you move this over here, and like, okay, yeah, it basically behaves the same way as this other model. So like mistakes like that can happen. And it can just be oversight. And that's one of like the beautiful like blossomings of further research, is people can be like, oh, we've been using this model for years that we didn't understand that there's actually this other piece that needs to be plugged into it. And how do we do that? Or it's like, oh, great, now finally we have the computing power to process, like, I mean, the whole big data world is all about this. Like, how do we get the the computer processing ability or capability to work with like, not like hundreds of data points, but billions of data points. Like, with genetic research, I mean, we can create whole genomic, sequences, which are literally going to be billions of like nucleotide base sequences. How do we understand that and put that into a context and work through that without, our computers just like free, like you cannot do it with a desktop computer. Don't try it at home. So that's sort of that modeling thing is really important and interesting to me. So.
Great answer. Thanks. should a layperson like me be concerned about statistical relevance in studies? If so, how can I tell if there's a concern?
Yes. Well, it depends on the concern. It depends what one would term relevance. There's there's statistical significance and insignificance. There's also statistical, what I would call, it might be significant, but is it meaningful? So a very, very small difference can be statistically significant. But, for instance, if you apply a biofertilizer, maybe it makes an inch worth of growth difference in your plants over the course of a season. That is going to be statistically significant. Is it going to be meaningfully significant? Not if that biofertilizer cost you hundreds of dollars. So in that case, you might see a study where biofertilizer, statistically, like significantly increases growth of whatever, your corn crop, whatever. Pick something. So that's great. This is significant. You run out and buy a bunch of biofertilizer, and you haven't understood the underpinning of that it because it was this huge sample size, it came up with a significant difference. But you're like, oh, I only got an inch of growth and it cost me like $600 an acre. Like, in that case, yes, it is very valuable, literally economically valuable for you as a layperson to understand those kinds of differences. In terms of like reading news headlines, like, you'll see things like 9 out of 10. Well, 90% certainty is typically under what we, as a scientific community, the scientific community accepts as statistically meaningful. So typically that's 95%. So what that means is that it's, if it's statistically significant, there's a 5% likelihood or chance that those results would be seen just purely by chance. So if you're seeing something that's like, oh, 9 out of 10, I'm like, wow, not 90%, that's a lot. It's like, well, it is, but it's not statistically significant. So it depends on what you're reading, whether or not that's going to be meaningful. And I know you're in the course, so we're going to be talking about that more, and I'll try to break it down in like a way that's digestible. But that's really understanding the numbers behind the headlines. Is that's that how that understanding for a layperson is important. We'll get into that. So I'd say yes,
Awesome.
Yes, up to a point. The other part, actually, I'm going to dwell on that for a minute, is that especially in like biological sciences and a lot of people go into biology not because they want to study statistics and numbers, is because they want to go like me, they want to go to Costa Rica and catch frogs, and they want to go to like the Peruvian Amazon and catch cool looking birds, or they want to go to Africa and they want to do like cool biological research and work in amazing ecosystems. They don't want to do statistics. One of the, I think the results of that has been is this very heavy reliance on like p-values, which is that 5% likelihood that I was referring to, and sort of like what we call hypothesis testing, which is like, is this thing here or is it not? Does this effect exist or does it not? And there's much better questions that we can ask, and we can ask them in much better ways. So that is an interesting conversation for a layperson that might be interested in some of the deeper layers of statistics and some of the theory behind statistics. So, okay.
Awesome. Jorvan, the course sounds interesting, but it seems like 9 hours of content are very little for such big topics. I'm a bit concerned I may not get enough out of it. Also, since I've been thinking about these questions already, is there a money back guarantee? So Jorvan, it's an introduction course. It's not a comprehensive deep dive. It's not a 4-year degree. It is an introduction to the concepts to understand them at a greater depth. If you walk into the course with an expectations that 9 hours is going to be 900 hours and you're going to walk away with a degree, your expectations will not be met. The expectations for the course are laid out on the course page in terms of an introduction and a deeper understanding. There is a money back guarantee. If after the third course, the third session out of the 6, it's not meeting the expectations that we've stated on the site, or it's just totally unsatisfying to you, then you will receive your money back. Susan, anything to add there?
No, that, I like we said, we spoke to this morning too. I want people to be super happy with this course. I'm really stoked about it. So if you're not, talk to us for sure. But yeah, I would give it until the third session, which actually gives you 4 weeks. So it gives you that, it'll be our introductions in the first week and kind of talking about like, logistics and sort of getting our feet wet. And then 2 fairly deep dive sessions and in an integration week in the middle. So if you've gone through those weeks and are showing up for the webinars and going through the material and you're not happy, then yeah, by all means contact us. And
so, yeah, but I think the other thing is walk in knowing what you're receiving. You're not walking into 900 hours, 90 hours. You're walking into 9 hours of an introduction. Our hope is that this spurs a number of different courses. One that's a longer course about actually setting up from beginning to end a trial, where we walk with you through that entire process over a planning season and an implementation season, which would be a much deeper dive of the course. But hopefully that answers your question there, Jordan.
Yeah, I also actually want to say that if you get in there and you decide it's not for you, or you're thinking, something, ideas for what a deeper dive might look like, I'd be totally interested to chat about that. I can see that Chorvin's not actually here anymore. He stepped out, so
he's still on the attendee list.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, at the bottom.
Oh, I just tried to individually chat him. I didn't see him. I just tried to look for his name there. Okay, never mind.
Cool.
Oh, there we go.
Stacy.
Gotcha.
Course looks great, but will you run it again later this year? Spring farming schedule is already jammed up. I do education stuff during the winter. We totally hear you. One of the ways that regenerative living is set up is that once the course is done live, you can purchase the course online as a perennial course. And at some point, depending on where this goes, it may turn into a membership site where you have access to everything. Will we run it again? I will say it will depend on how the first run goes. If we get the requisite number of people into the course and we have a good time with it and we enjoy it, this is one of the things everyone forgets. We're supposed to enjoy life. And so if we really enjoy the course and we enjoy working with the students and it's an enjoyable time, I imagine there will be an opportunity for us to do it again, as I've been doing with understanding working with living soils and Joe Tobias. I just chatted with her the other day and she's like, I want to do that again. It's like, great, let's do it again. So chances are If we enjoy it, we will. And if we don't, it will be perennial for you to take a look at forever and ever. Susan, anything else to add there?
Yeah, I also totally appreciate that it's running into the farming schedule. And that was definitely on the conversation of like, oh, do we launch this in March? The scheduling just worked out that we're like, we either run it in March or we don't run it at all, for another number of months. And we were just like, okay, let's just like get the first run going, get that first wheel going. So the other thing I would say is probably the next round, the price will go up. I don't want to say that like 100%, but it probably will. Just knowing the amount of work and additional materials I want to create for it. So if you get in now, like you don't even have to take it, but you could be around for a future iteration of the course. And so I would say that it's kind of a good opportunity to get in for the beta, for the well thought out beta run, if you're interested. So.
Awesome. And then Jules gave an addition to propose to my school system. So if you're looking for curriculum for your school system around permaculture, Matt Powers has put together a phenomenal curriculum for K through 12 for curriculum in that conversation, and I would highly recommend it. He had me look through it to take a look at for the BC, British Columbia province in Canada, for the BC curriculum, and looked phenomenal. And that's what's so interesting about being alive today, is that if you find that little niche that you're really excited about, you can bring that to the individuals that you're keen on, and work through. So thanks so much. Well, Susan, we've finished our Q&A, and really excited to have folks jump into the course. Oh, we just had another one.
I just saw Charvin's question. Does lifetime access mean that one has access to future versions of the course as well? Javan, this is Javan's platform, so I'm going to hand that question to you.
Yeah, I don't know if we've come to that crossroads yet. I don't know if we'll do that. I imagine there will be access to the existing course as is. If you pay for a live course, you may have access to the pre-recorded or the recorded versions moving forward, but the price difference on regenerative living will be between a live course and a canned course. So the canned course will be significantly cheaper than the live course, and the live courses will always be new and will have fresh intake. It's a good question. I haven't really thought about it that much yet, but I will probably come to a decision after the next couple of years. So thanks for that one. Awesome. Well, Susan, thank you. Thank you so much for not just today, but all you do, your work. It's just phenomenal to have an incredible resource like yourself being open to speak on these topics and just have the cognition to be able to do so. I just so appreciate you in so many ways. I get to do it publicly now, because I usually do it privately. But thank you very much. And just thank you to everybody who showed up today. So appreciate, we had 28 people that came right to the end with us, which is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that.
Really appreciate everyone's time and attention and great questions.
Yeah. So, anything else you'd like to say, Susan, as a final close?
I'd love to see, I see a few familiar names and I see lots of new ones, and I always love that balance. And I'm just really excited to dig in more with some of you in the course. I saw a few that are already signed up for the course, and just remember that discount's going to land until Sunday. So even if you're interested, go and check out the course. If you've got questions, feel free to email either Javan or I. So I'm just really excited, and I really enjoyed this. It was like, I had a lot of anxiety this morning, but we're okay. We're good. So it was great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, everybody. The replay will be sent out in the next couple of days, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks again.